Welcome to our final Policy in Practice seminar for this academic year. This is hosted by the Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy. I also want to thank the UCL Policy Lab for their input and support of the panel tonight. My name is Alex Hartman, and I'm an associate professor in the Political Science Department here at UCL, and I'm going to be chairing the panel this evening. I want to express gratitude for everyone here who found the room. That is the first test of intelligence to get to participate in the conversation, so you all passed with flying colors. Yes, but I'm very grateful that everyone has turned out, and also for future people who will access this online, we're grateful for your views as well. So the topic for tonight's event is integrating immigrants. How can European countries do better? And we're going to include the UK in that bucket of focus. And in the event tonight, we're going to delve into the multifaceted issues surrounding the integration of immigrants and people on the move in European countries and the UK. And I've asked the experts who we've gathered here tonight to think about three interrelated questions on this topic. So the first question is what we know about what policies to integrate people on the move work. So what we know about what works. I also wanted them to reflect on what we know about public opinion on this topic, which of course is of great interest to the news media and politicians in many countries, and this one as well. And then I also asked them to consider the conundrum of the political challenges that we often face in getting good policy in place. Obviously good for one, maybe, and not so great for someone else. And we can think about whether policy ought to work or whether it ought to serve other interests, and I'll leave that to the panelists to kind of work out. So to discuss the topic at hand, I'm very excited to welcome three panelists this evening. So the first is Professor David Laitin, who is the James T. Watkins and Elise Watkins Professor in the Department of Political Science at Stanford University. Among his wide-ranging research contributions, Professor Laitin has studied the issues of immigrant integration in Europe. He's conducted ethnographic survey and experimental research on Muslim integration in France. He has a wonderful book on why Muslim integration fails in Christian heritage societies. He is also the co-director of Stanford's Immigration Policy Lab. He's co-authored numerous very important papers in political science and economics, and has had a wide-ranging impact on policy in this area. Next, I would like to introduce Christabel Cooper, who is the Director of Research at Labor Together. She has spent 15 years working as a data analyst in the private sector, specializing in big data. She's also worked with data praxis, particularly in analyzing the 2019 general election result. She's carried out extensive research and polling with YouGov, especially with a focus on Brexit and the Brexit referendum, which we're sadly all too familiar with. And she was also formerly a labor counselor in Hammersmith and Fulham, so she gets so much, admiration on my part for serving the public. It's amazing. Finally, but last but not least, I have Marley Morris, who's an associate director on migration, trade, and communities at the Institute for Public Policy Research. His research includes studies on new points-based immigration systems, they're used globally, the impacts of the hostile environment, the distributional effects of Brexit, public attitudes to immigration and trade. He's written numerous reports, articles, and policy briefings on these topics, regularly provides expert analysis for the national and international press and for broadcast media, and he has expertise also on the question of dispersal and housing on the UK, which hopefully we'll talk about, but if not on this panel, maybe later tonight. With not too much further ado, I just want to briefly review the format that our panel is going to take, and then we're going to move ahead. So what's going to happen next is that each speaker is going to share their reflections for, 7 or 8 minutes each. We'll see. This is a smaller group, so maybe we can give everyone, as much time as they need, hopefully. Then we're going to have the panelists engage in a conversation, so we'll have a chance for them to respond to each other's comments and thoughts. And then we'll open the floor for your questions in the latter part of the session. As we briefly discussed before I took up the mic, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page, The whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website and on the YouTube channel, and also as part of a podcast. So this will be available in multiple venues. I think everyone should reflect upon that when they make their intervention, since nothing will die once it's on the internet, as we all know. So if you don't speak, you will not at all be recorded, and so if you don't wish to be part of the record of this, just don't take up the microphone. And that's, probably pretty straightforward. And we would love it if you did want to share these outputs with anyone who's interested, and we'll provide ways to do that via the UCL media channels. Okay, and without further ado, I'm going to get started. And so David, I'd asked if you were okay to go first. Is that all right still?
Yeah.
Great. And so you have some slides, so I'm just going to make space for you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Any questions? I'm only going to address, in a very narrow academic way, the first set of questions that Alex raised, and that is, what is the effect of public policy on integration outcomes in Europe? So the Immigration Policy Lab at Stanford and Zurich has been studying a whole range of policy initiatives in regard to integration of immigrants and refugees. And I want to report to you what we think we've learned about this. And the first thing is, how do we know if integration is successful? If you don't know that, you can't make any claims that this policy succeeded. And we at the lab developed an index. We call it the IPL-12, a simple 2-3 minute questionnaire, which I will describe later, that gives you some assessment on success of immigrants in their host societies. And once we have that tool, that index, we can start studying particular policies. And you see on the screen that we have no general theory of what works, but we have a whole set of specific studies, of which I'm going to discuss 4, where we've learned something about the effect of government intervention and integration success. And all of these four issues, we were able to judge the success based upon the tool that we developed. So IPL-12 is a measurement tool of integration. We see the IPL-12 to understand integration of immigrants as multidimensional. It's not yes or no, but it differs on a variety of dimensions. We see the economic, social, psychological, political, linguistic, and navigational aspects of integration as having each a separate score, which we combine into a general IPL-12. But you will find people, if I can go from my 5-minute plan to a 7-minute plan, you'll find people, say, the spouses of high-tech workers in Silicon Valley, who score very high on economic, but have never met an American in 2 years in Silicon Valley, an American meaning an American citizen. So social integration is very low, economic integration is very high. So we'll be able to assess policies on the degree to which they achieve integration on each of these dimensions. And this allows us to detect overall comparisons across time and place, and to see which dimensions are most difficult to succeed for immigrants in any particular group over time. One of the challenges of the IPL-12 is to be able to ask questions that can be used both in Jordan and in Silicon Valley, and would have the same meaning to the respondents. So if you ask a question of whether you have a car or not as a sign of success, this would be crucial for California, but useless in London. So you need to find out ways of giving questions which will have meaning across time and place. So when we first worked and developed the IPL-12, we wanted to know whether there was some external validity. That is, if we gave this index to a variety of different immigrant groups, it would more or less come out as we expected. And if it didn't, we would wonder about whether this is really measuring what we think we're measuring. That's what we mean by validity, if it's measuring what we think we're measuring. So we did an online survey of wealthy immigrants to the US, a cross-section of immigrants in Germany, applicants for citizenship in New York, and students of English as a second language in California. And what we found for each of these 4 groups, A, B, C, D, that the years in residency in the host country differed. So for the wealthy immigrants to the U.S., the mean years was around 38 years. For Group B, the cross-section of immigrants in Germany, it was about 20 years. For applicants for citizenship in New York, it was about 5 or 6 years. And the ESL students in California, about 1 or 2 years. So you would expect A to be far more integrated on average than D. And if it wasn't, we'd wonder about our measure. And what we see here is the IPL score from 0 to 1. Group A is around 0.8. Group B is about 0.7. Group C is around 0.5. And Group D is somewhat lower than that. And this gave us confidence. We did a whole range of tests of this sort to make us feel confident that the measure we had was actually measuring what we thought we were measuring. So, case studies. I'm going to talk about 4 of them today and what we've learned, and with a touch of policy recommendation that followed. So this work done by Jens Heinmuller at Stanford, Dominique Hangartner at the ETH in Zurich, and several others, looked at asylum petitions from 1994 through 2004 in Switzerland. And what they found is the way the Swiss dealt with asylum petitions is they had a set of translators, say in Farsi or in Swahili or in Arabic, and or in language of South Sudan. And what they would do is, if they had a sufficient number of people who fit this category of nationality, then they would bring in a translator to do all the interviews. So you had people from certain parts of the world who waited 1.5 years, 2 years before enough people from their group were there for them to be interviewed. And some came in and they were the 50th person and had only 2 weeks. So this is, we call this exogenous. It wasn't because of who they were or what kind of people they were. It was the luck of the draw, whether you were the first of your group or the 50th of your group. And for those who were approved, for asylum, an additional year of waiting time reduced subsequent employment rate after a year by more than 4%. This meant that the longer you waited for your interview, the less likely you'd be working a year after acceptance, by a lot. And what the authors did is went to the Swiss Immigration Bureau and said, you've got it wrong, that you've got to give people less wait time. It would save the country money from social benefits if you reduced wait time. And they showed this data to the immigration services, and Switzerland changed its policy and had much more rapid interviews for their asylum applicants. So marginally reducing waiting time reduces public expenditures and unlocks economic potential of the asylees. So this is a finding which has an effect on policy, and the recommendation is the more you wait to approve working for asylum refugees, the better off it will be for both them, that will get into the workforce, and for the country. Alex mentioned this in work I've done with Muslim integration in France. I wanted to know the degree to which Muslims faced higher barriers to integration in France than if everything were like them, but they weren't Muslims. How can you figure that out? How can you actually identify a Muslim effect? What I did is looked at two groups that came from Senegal, the Seras and the Jolas, who were half Muslims, half of them were Muslims and half of them were Christians. But otherwise, they all came from peasant backgrounds. They all came from the same region in Senegal, and most of them were children of people who came to France in the 1970s during a big drought in Senegal, and when France thought they needed more workers for their mega industries. What I found is that after a generation and a half, the average income of the Muslims was 15% lower than the Christians. And we spent a year and a half, 2 years trying to figure out why. And we found that there was a degree of discrimination against Muslims. Not big, but small. That is some degree of favoritism if the French could figure out the Senegalese guy was a Muslim or a Christian. The Senegalese Muslims figured out that they were facing this discrimination and therefore felt that they would never really be accepted into France and put less effort in being integrated. And we called this a discriminatory equilibrium. This confirmed for the French that the Muslims didn't want to be integrated because they were working less hard at it. And the reason why they were working less hard at it is because they faced an initial discrimination. And it worked like a self-reinforcing process. So what we made a recommendation, which hasn't been followed, is to see if we can reduce everyday discrimination. And we had ideas of training and testing HR employees at the big firms to see if whether, in fact, they were implicitly ranking the Muslim applicants a little bit lower because they feared that their bosses maybe didn't want to see too many Muslims hired in places where the public would see them. And we think of this as a policy recommendation to get rid of the initial discrimination, which may then lead to a different behavioral pattern of the Muslims to try to succeed because they think they would be able to succeed in a country that today systematically discriminates against them. Then we looked more recently at welcoming contracts. Welcoming contracts have now been adopted in about 9 or 10 European countries. They're basically civic integration policies adopted by many European countries post-2000. So what they do is they condition entry, permanent residence, and citizenship on attending courses in the language, and generally free language courses, and civic skills. And the idea here is that immigrants should have to show a willingness to learn the language and to learn the civic skills of becoming French or Austrian or Dutch or Swedish, that they show that they are willing to pay the costs of becoming French or Italian or Austrian. Although mandatory, these were proposed by center-right governments, not radical governments, as progressive and a welcoming policy. You're welcoming them, saying, we're giving you free language instruction, we're teaching you about liberty, equality, and fraternity, we're teaching you about gender equality, so you'll know how to act like a French person, and you'll do much better here. It was seen as a welcoming contract. So our team leveraged now a little bit of wonky science, leveraged the staggered introduction of this welcoming contract so we'd be able to compare like people who came to France at the same time. Some of them got the welcoming contract and some didn't have to sign it. So you were able to get, in a sense, true comparison of people came at the same time from the same place, but some got it and some didn't. And we leveraged this staggered introduction of France's integration contract across all the departments. Then we used census data, labor force surveys, and our own surveys, that is the IPL-12. And what we found that people who were forced to do this were not angry. In fact, they were quite happy they got this contract. However, after several years, the integration levels of those who signed the contract or those who didn't have to sign the contract were perfectly the same. no return whatsoever on the investment of these expensive programs. So the recommendation we made, even though this was done with heartfelt, welcoming, the French government was paying a whole lot of money for no obvious returns. And our recommendations was to refine or abandon these programs for ones that would work better. And we really appreciate partners that will allow us to do experimental work and be told the policies they think are most successful actually don't have any yield. So that contract showed, I think, the use of academic research to weed out programs which are well-intentioned but failure. The final policy on rural decline in Sweden, and Professor Marbach here is one of the key authors of this paper, and it was a pleasure learning from him as we wrote it. Cross-national data show systematic population losses throughout Western Europe and the US in the old manufacturing towns. I forgot the exact number, but some substantial number of counties in both Europe and in the United States have in the last 20 years systematically lost population to the mega cities. We had electoral data in Sweden over 5 elections to show a relationship, correlation between emigration, that is, loss of population in these old manufacturing towns, and voting for the anti-immigrant, radical right populist party, in this case, the Swedish Democrats. So the Swedish Democrats were winning in places not where there was immigration of large-scale immigration, taking away jobs, but they were voting for the Swedish Democrats in these places that they felt abandoned by the state. And the radical right parties were using an ideology of anti-immigrant bias, anti-immigrant policy, in order to win votes in places that weren't receiving any immigrants at all. The Swedish Democrats blamed rural decline on immigration, and they succeeded, and part of their success, and now they're part of the governing coalition, which is for a former fascist party, this is worrisome for the future of democracy in Europe. So our recommendation, after we did some, not me because I don't speak a word of Swedish, but one of members of our team interviewed social democratic operatives in Sweden and asked them about how much they're losing support in these manufacturing towns. And how much of their of social democrat and, of course, green effort is going to places with high immigration but less support for these populist parties. And the answer was because we can get more votes in the big cities. Our recommendation is that the center and center-left parties should not copy the manifestos as they're now doing by becoming more and more anti-immigrant. We think that's the wrong way to go, but they should try to spend more effort at addressing rural discontent and the loss of social services. And even though that doesn't sound like integration policy, we think that would be a way to reduce the support of anti-immigrant parties in Europe. In conclusion, integration of immigrants and refugees from cultural environments quite distinct from Europe is a major challenge of our time, or else we wouldn't be having this panel. My big point from the 4 cases that I've discussed today, there is no silver bullet to hasten the process. There's nothing that we can snap our fingers and said, we at the Immigration Policy Lab have figured out how to make integration successful. Here, I've shown how targeted public policies can lower the barriers to success, both for the immigrants and hosting communities. And this is the kind of research, I think, which in the long term will have the effect of lowering the barriers to successful integration. Thanks for listening.
Okay, Christabel, you're up next.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Is that right? So I'm going to equally be parochial and take the second part of your questions to us and talk about public opinion, which is what I do at the think tank I work for. And yeah, I'm afraid I'm probably going to also be parochial in terms of geography, given that most of the work we do is based in the UK, but I suspect that there are lessons that can be learned across other territories. I want to start out just by making the point that public opinion on migration is a lot more complex than I think people sometimes think it is. And I think that the misunderstandings about what the public really think are contributing, certainly in the UK, to some fairly terrible policy decisions. So I just wanted to go through what the numbers really tell us about what people think. I think sometimes something that's often missed here in the UK is that whilst, obviously at the moment, migration is a big issue, there is a certain amount of hostility towards migration. It's often forgotten that in the past, there was huge opposition to, for example, Commonwealth immigration in the 40s and 50s. And the long-term trend has actually been towards attitudes becoming more positive. Within that, we've got fluctuations that are generally related to the number of migrants, very roughly related to the number of migrants coming in. So when you have a big migration shock, you get an increase in salience of immigration, and you often get an increase in negativity towards migrants. But over the long term, it actually has been broadly a trend towards more positivity, and that will be driven in part by education. People with degrees are more likely to have more liberal attitudes towards migration, and also simply by people being used to there being greater diversity in the UK. So in 2015, we saw the salience and negativity towards migration rise in line with increased migration. It was actually falling just before the vote to leave the EU, though obviously it was a huge contributor to that vote. But directly after the vote to leave, there was actually a big drop in concern and in salience, which I think people generally attribute to the feeling that the sense of control, I mean, in the words of the slogan, that many people did feel that it had granted a sense of control over migration. However, we know that since 2021, salience and concern, negativity towards migrants has been rising again. But I think it's really worth bearing in mind that at the moment, the numbers of net numbers of migrants, certainly for, I think, 2022, is that the last one? That's the last numbers that we have, were twice as high as they were in 2015, and yet salience is half what it was in 2015. So again, you can see the effect of, there is clearly sort of a change that has happened even between that time. And generally, in most polls, you can see that there's a slightly more people will tend to think that migration has overall been good for Britain than think that it has not. I don't know, some of you may have seen John Murdoch's recent charts showing public opinion on migration. And what's really interesting is that he's shown that the rise in concern is almost exclusively among people who support the Conservatives. So previous to this time, you see the numbers of people who are worried about migration, who support the Conservatives and Labour. The numbers for Labour are always lower, but they rise and fall in tandem. But this recent rise in concern about migration is really being driven almost exclusively by Tory voters. And obviously it's very, very hard to prove what's the relationship between causation and correlation. But I think there's a theory that the rhetoric that's coming from the Tory government is activating their supporters, but not particularly anyone else. But even so, we know that a fairly large number of people do cite migration as one of the most important issues facing the UK at the moment. So it's about a third of people who say that. And of those people, generally, they're concerned they're worried about high numbers. They're pretty negative about migration. These people are also more likely to be swing voters, and so we have a sort of situation where political parties are therefore incentivized to think about the views of those particular people, perhaps more than the people who don't cite immigration as a top priority, but who may have more positive attitudes towards it. But having said that, I think there's relatively little attention paid to what is really underlying that scepticism about migration. We've got the current, apparently sort of contradictory finding at the moment, which just keeps being repeated in polls, that whilst a majority of people want migration to be reduced, yet when they're asked about, for example, when you go through a list of professions or jobs, whether you want to reduce the number of healthcare workers, social care workers, construction workers, even sort of agricultural workers, people will generally say that they want the numbers to stay the same or even to increase. The only profession that people want to see less of is bankers. There's this kind of contradiction between people saying that they want fewer migrants, and actually, when you say, well, do you want any less of each kind of migrant except bankers, they say they would like to keep the numbers the same. And I think that can be explained by the fact that, you know, a lot of migration skeptics believe that there is migration to this country and those migrants are not doing any jobs or not making any contribution to the economy. And then that's pretty much confirmed when you poll people and ask them, who do you think the biggest number of migrants coming? What type of migrants are coming to Britain? A majority of people will answer asylum seekers, which of course is simply not the case. So we've done some polling at Labour Together. We'll release the results in full next week, but so a bit of an exclusive here. But we asked people, you know, what their biggest concern was about migration. And amongst those migration skeptics, so these are people that said that migration was one of their most important issues. We found that the biggest concern about migration was the pressure it put on public services, followed by worries about failure to integrate, and then worries about pressure on housing. They also thought that the asylum system was unfair. Over 80% of migration skeptics think that the majority of asylum seekers are making false claims. Again, we know this not to be true, but this is a really overwhelming number that believe that the system is unfair. So you've got a situation where people are believing that there's large numbers of asylum seekers coming in, that most of them are coming unfairly, and that large numbers of them are not making, they are taking from the system without giving back, and that they are failing to integrate. So I don't think it's just enough to say to people, well, you're wrong. I mean, I'm sure all of us have tried that at some point, and I personally, my experiences of that has been somewhat negative. So I think policymakers do need to take account of public opinion, to take account of like what lies behind people's skepticism of migration when they're making policy, and think about how we reassure people that the asylum system is fair, that it's making good decisions, that it's controlled, and that migrants are making a contribution and integrating. So one of the things we really found that was people were really positive about people who embark on a journey towards citizenship. We found that we gave people a scenario where a migrant had taken citizenship and a migrant had not taken citizenship, and people were much more likely to believe that the migrant who had taken citizenship was making a contribution to the economy than the one who wasn't. So, and we also found, you know, people were large numbers of people thought that people caught up in the Windrush scandal should automatically get British passports. Most people thought that people who had settled here from the EU permanently should be fast-tracked to citizenship. People thought that people born in Britain should have automatic rights to citizenship, even if both of their parents were not British. So all of these things kind of, you know, the Windrush generation is I think, interesting. There was a lot of sympathy towards the Windrush generation. I think because people really thought that these are people who had come to Britain and made a contribution and had integrated, and that it was really unfair what had happened to them. So, and also, you know, they also believe that asylum seekers should be allowed to work whilst waiting for their claims. Again, playing into that sense that migrants should be making a contribution. So I think what the message from that for me is that actually there are things that policymakers can do to address quite a lot of the scepticism that they see in the headline polls. It's just that often they don't think beyond those headline polls, just see the negativity and just think, okay, we've got to reduce the numbers, without actually dealing with some of the underlying issues. We found that of the migration skeptics, 70% thought that there was some benefits to migration. There's very few people who really just reject migration altogether. It is just that they feel that there are, people are not making a contribution, they're not coming here fairly, and that they're putting pressure on public services that they're not contributing to. So I guess my message overall is that actually there shouldn't be a contradiction between good policy making and public opinion, but often it's just that failure to explore a bit below the surface. And actually more policies that do focus on integration, that focus on paths to citizenship, I think probably would have a pretty beneficial result, not just for migrants themselves, but for the UK in general.
Thanks, Christabel. Marley?
Great, thank you. No, those are both very interesting talks, and hopefully what I have to say will be complementary. So I think just to start off, I just wanted to set out, I think, some of the evidence about integration in the UK, because I think actually there's a really positive story to tell about the integration of migrants in the UK. And in fact, even if you compare it to the rest of Europe, the UK stands out as a real success story. Just a few facts and stats to kick things off. First of all, so there's a 75% employment rate of foreign-born people in the UK. That's 10 percentage points higher than the EU average, and it's worth saying that that's higher for both men and women. It's higher for the EU and non-EU migrants. So there's a kind of consistent success when it comes to employment outcomes, or at least when it comes to employment rates for migrants in the UK compared to the rest of Europe. That's really striking, and it's notable when compared to most other European countries. Secondly, English language, again, a real success story. Around 87% of recent arrivals between 2011 and 2021, the latest census, speak English well or have it as their main language. So most people do speak English and speak English very well. Again, on education, look at children with English as an additional language. Yes, there are some gaps between those children and other children, but over time they close, and by the age of 16 they are largely the same. So again, you're seeing positive stories in education, particularly we look at evidence from London over the past couple of decades, look at education outcomes by different ethnic groups. Those gaps have largely closed, and in many cases it's white British pupils who are now falling behind. We look at geographical segregation. Ethnic segregation is on the decline and has decreased for all groups according to the latest data from the 2021 census. And again, as Christabel was saying, public attitudes, those are also moving in a positive direction. If you look at some of the evidence on feelings of patriotism among different migrant groups, again, extremely high compared to other countries. So I think across a whole range of measures, integration is really positive for the UK. And there's been a lot of negativity in the press in the last few months. And actually, I think it's not borne out by the evidence whatsoever. Now, that's not to say that there aren't major challenges, and just to highlight three in particular where I think there are big challenges in the UK. Firstly, on housing, obviously we have a housing crisis in the UK across the board, but there's particular challenges for migrant communities. Migrants are more likely to live in private sector accommodation, particularly in overcrowded accommodation, and we know if we look at particular groups, for instance, recent refugees who have come or asylum seekers, there are special challenges there for people in accommodation. Secondly, overqualification. So we know that, as I was saying before, employment rates are really high for migrant groups in general, but there is a real issue around overqualification. So the overqualification rates of migrants are around 26% compared to 20% for UK born. So there is an issue there where you have lots of highly skilled migrants coming to the UK who are tending to be working in jobs that are below their qualification level. And thirdly, there's an issue with poverty and child poverty, and we saw stats coming out in general for that today, where there were some real concerns because of the cost of living crisis. I think this is particularly affecting some migrant communities, and there's some data from the last few years showing there's a higher share of households with children from migrant backgrounds facing material deprivation. So I think particular concerns around child poverty there, and I'll come back to that later because I think there were some specific policy reasons for why that's the case. It's also worth saying that there are big differences between migrants' integration journeys depending on their particular status, depending on how long they've come here, as we were talking about before, and in particular specific challenges for refugees and asylum seekers because of their reasons for coming, because of their potential past trauma, and because of the policy framework that they face when they get here. So going to the question of how to do better, well, there are three areas in particular that I just want to highlight. I think based on evidence in the last few years of what's worked well from a policy perspective. Firstly, I think it's clear that an effective policy needs a clear and comprehensive integration strategy. We haven't really had a strategy for England over the past decade or so. We have had a strategy in Scotland, and I think the evidence there, we did some work looking in particular at the strategy in Scotland and with the Scottish Government and with local authorities in Scotland in the last couple of years. And the evidence there was actually there was a real positive support from local authorities working on the ground for that strategy and how it had helped to shape integration outcomes. So I think the evidence is that strategy can be really effective at helping to provide a clear direction of travel, helping to think about the different components of integration, and setting out what the values of the country are when it comes to pushing forward migrant integration. But crucially, the evidence from the work we did in Scotland pointed to the fact that you need investment, you need funding to back up a strategy for it to be effective. And there's evidence, I think, of that working in the UK. Good evidence, for instance, of the Migration Impacts Fund and the Controlling Migration Fund, which were set up by both Labour and coalition governments to support communities where there had been recent increases in migration, which helped to address some of the issues that Christabel was talking about around concerns around public services, and also helped to support integration on the ground. And then I think a real example of success, and there's been multiple evaluations showing how effective it was, and probably, frankly, the most effective refugee scheme in the history of the UK was the Syrian Vulnerable Persons Scheme, which was set up, I think, around 2015, and which resettled thousands of Syrian refugees. And one of the reasons why it worked effectively, according to the evaluation, was that it was well funded and it had a flexible tariff, an annual tariff for local authorities, which allowed for a range of different forms of support to be coordinated at the local level, and which provided real opportunities for migrants, so that you got a really impressive, comprehensive level of support. Now that hasn't been matched in recent years with, for instance, some of the more recent schemes, which have been there's been less preparation, more ad hoc. There has been a lot of funding behind it, but it hasn't been well coordinated and planned in advance, and that has led to a fragmentation of the system and real pressures at the local level. So I think, again, learning from how that scheme worked, where it was well funded, it was planned in advance, it was flexible funding at the local level, shows the integration can work, and it can work well when it's designed effectively. The second area, just to highlight, which again links to the point I made around the Syrian scheme, is that you need local coordination, and this again came out through from the study we did in Scotland, as well as multiple other studies. Having a multi-agency approach with buy-in across local services, whether it's housing, health, English language, employability, children's and social services, the police, and also delivery in partnership with local communities. So getting the local community and voluntary sector involved has been really critical. There's loads of really good examples and case studies of effective work being done between local government and the charity sector, the community sector on the ground. In particular, where there's been work being done by organisations that are migrant or refugee led, and where they're able to build a sense of agency and control over the process of integration, and some really positive outcomes there. So happy to talk about that more in the discussion. And then finally, and this links, I think, some of the discussion we had before, I think we need to make sure that our immigration system is integration proof. So one example, I think, was a great case study around the asylum, the length of wait for processing asylum. We know we've got a problem with that in the UK at the moment, where a lot of people have been waiting, in some cases, many years for their asylum claim. And clearly, that has a detrimental impact on integration, particularly when there's no right to work attached, and so you're basically stuck with very little support and no ability to access the labour market for very long periods. That's going to have that long-term detrimental effect, as the evidence says. But there are also a number of other areas, I think, where work needs to be done. As Christopher pointed out, pathways to settlement and citizenship are an area which the public support and which are crucial to integration. We currently have a system where some people are trapped on very, very long routes to settlement, where they have to repeatedly make applications, spending huge amounts of money on fees, thousands and thousands of pounds for them and their families, and running the risk every couple of years of falling out of immigration status, and then running the risk of facing the hostile environment. So there are massive problems with our routes to settlement at the moment. And again, the cost of citizenship is extraordinary at the moment. Thousands of pounds you have to pay in order to get citizenship. We've even seen, I think, in the last 24 hours, the cost of paying for leave to remain go up by a few £100s more. So, I mean, these costs are really challenging for people. In many cases, people aren't aware that there are ways to get fee waivers, and there's no way to get a fee waiver for settlement, which means that people can often get stuck in a kind of cycle where they're able to apply for leave to remain for a couple of years, but they can never get that long-term secure status in the UK. Again, at the moment, we have a system where people are trapped in poverty in many cases in the immigration system because of our system, which puts a no recourse to public funds condition, i.e. people can't access mainstream benefits in some cases. Now, in some cases, that's not a problem, because if you're a high paid person on a skilled worker route, then you're generally not going to need access to the welfare system. But there are other people, for instance, as I mentioned, on this long 10-year route to settlement, and many people who may be working in very low-paid jobs who can't access support, and who are at risk of struggling, and struggling particularly when we look at economic integration, will struggle on that particular dimension of integration. And then finally, and Christopher mentioned the Windrush scandal, tackling discrimination within the immigration system is another critical area. The Windrush Lessons Learned review from a couple of years ago, after the Windrush scandal, pointed to a number of areas where people are face discrimination because of the current Home Office practices. I think thinking about how the Home Office can reform and how to design a system that ensures that even inadvertently there isn't discrimination baked into the system will play an important role in thinking about integration for people in the long run as well. So those are a few areas, but I think thinking more broadly about how the immigration system needs to be integration proofed, how you think about integration in the context of the immigration system as a whole, is a crucial thing, which frankly has fallen off the agenda for the Home Office and for the government for the last 10 to 15 years.
Great, thank you. Yes, on mic. So thank you so much, Marley. That was great. And thank you to our three panelists for these wonderful contributions. Mindful of time and that we have around 20 minutes remaining, I think what I'll do is turn over the floor to those who've come tonight. And we hope that you have questions. If there's a reticence to ask questions, I myself am happy to spark conversation up here. But I do want to offer the opportunity for those who are here to ask any question that they'd like of the panelists. So Eleanor, how does this usually work? Do you want to?
I'll just put the mic.
Okay. So.
Hello, I just wanted to thank you all for your contributions. It was really interesting. I had a question for David. I think the measure, the IPL12, seems really interesting, and I'm really interested in this social component of measuring social integration. And I was wondering if you could go a little bit more into what kind of indicators are used to measure social integration of immigrants. Because I know a lot of the difference in your study between Muslim and Christians in France was to do with these kind of cycles of discrimination, and that's definitely one aspect. But yeah, I'd be interested to see like how social integration is measured. Thank you.
I'm happy to talk about the IPL all evening. It's a very complex question we had to address, and that is, we want to know whether the immigrants go beyond their sort of home country social network to a wider social network, which includes, and then that's an X, we say Americans. But what is an American? We did what's called shout-outs in asking that question for a range of subjects, participants, to find out what they thought we were asking. And in the United States, if we ask them, how many Americans are on your favorite list on your phone, what do you mean by American? And they basically saw it as WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. And so if, in fact, they had on their list people who are African Americans, they're far longer than many of the WASPs. They may not consider that hanging out with Americans. So we decided at the end we had to leave this open. Whatever they thought of as an American who is not a member of your host country community, we were able to get some degree of understanding that they had a broader network. So that's one of the questions. Another one of the questions is, how often in the past few months have you had dinner with someone who is not of your host country society? Here, going back to the great German sociologist Max Weber, we think of commensality. If you can eat together, you're socially connected to them. So these are the kinds of questions we asked. And what we found is that this is an important barrier to overall success in the country for people who are unable to make these connections, whether through language abilities or through other forms of geographic concentration. So I'll stop there, but I'm happy to answer follow-up questions, but other people will have questions, I'm sure.
Hi, I'd just like to thank you again. It's been an absolutely brilliant panel. I've got a question for Christopher, if possible. You spoke about how there should be kind of a correlation between public opinion and the government's policy agenda. That's assuming that the government's policy agenda is meeting the expectations of the general public. So if it doesn't, like it doesn't in many cases, what can we expect, or what should we expect, either immigrants or the general public as a whole, to be able to do to kind of enforce this government agenda, even if it's not, within their expectations of themselves?
Well, I mean, the obvious answer and looks like being fulfilled is you can kick them out. And I mean, and what's very interesting about what the current government have attempted to do, which is to make immigration a wedge issue for the left, is it's actually become a wedge issue for their own voters. And I mean, I think today there's a YouGov poll where Reform are now within about 4 points of the Conservatives. You're seeing really huge numbers of people who, the Conservatives, they've raised their expectations that they are going to control immigration with these voters and then fail to fulfil them. And they really are, I doubt in a general election you'd see Reform get the level of support that you see in the opinion polls right now. But I think it will be significant, and I think it will do real damage to the Conservatives. So I think, you're playing with fire if you do attempt to embark on a policy agenda that you can't deliver. I think this is actually a perfect illustration of the damage that can be done as a result politically.
Yes, so again, I'd like to say thank you for all, your bit this afternoon as well. But just quickly, I am, as probably most of everyone else, I'm not Labour, I'm not left-wing, I'm more Conservative, so actually I've got a completely different kind of, if you want, a view on it all. And I apologise, the last person to speak, I can't remember what your name was, my apologies at all. If I'm not mistaken, you suggested that actually immigration was institutionally racist, saying that majority of people were coming with white from not Middle Eastern backgrounds. And what I suggest, the reason why for that is majority of them are illegal immigrants. Majority coming from Middle Eastern countries, for example, are illegal immigrants. That's why you're not seeing legal migration as such, like from Muslim backgrounds, things like that. What would you say upon that agenda? As you said, that obviously most people coming to this country legally aren't like black, aren't Muslim. I say that's mainly because most of them are illegal immigrants, and that's seen within a high percentage. As in you're suggesting, however, that they are more racist, institutionally racist towards immigrants and not letting that ethnic group come in.
Okay, I'm not quite following, but please come back to me if I haven't quite answered your question. So first of all, I think most of migration comes through regular routes. So the amount of people who are coming on small boats or coming through other irregular routes, it's actually a relatively small proportion of the total levels of migration. We have quite high levels of immigration at the moment. Net migration, as I said, it's around kind of 600,000-700,000. Immigration is actually probably a bit higher, around I think just over 1 million. Most of that is people coming as students, workers, family route, people coming through humanitarian routes such as the Ukraine, Hong Kong routes. Quite a small number. Only we're talking. Only for last year, I think it was around 30,000-40,000 coming on small boats, and maybe a bit more coming through irregular routes. So actually, a relatively small proportion. I wasn't quite the point of linking with ethnicity. My point was that. That there are issues around how the Home Office delivers immigration policy, which have implications for people, which can create discrimination. So an example of that, I know a lot of this came out through the Windrush Review, was there's some good evidence by the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants. For instance, the right to rent policy. The right to rent policy requires people requires landlords to check the immigration status of people in order to ensure that they have a legal right to rent their accommodation, and that basically creates creates unfair discrimination because landlords they're not immigration officers. So what happens is they end up unfairly discriminating against people from certain backgrounds. So there's some evidence to suggest that this can cause discrimination. It's contested, but there's evidence, as I say, point to this JCWI study. So I think the concern that we have is that the way that immigration policy is enforced can and is at risk of leading to racist outcomes. I'm not saying that anyone who has concerns about immigration is racist. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I'm saying that sometimes immigration policy, when enforced, can have these racist outcomes. Does that capture what is that a helpful response to what you're saying, or is there something else?
Yes, I'd say yes, yeah.
Okay.
If you don't have enough time, I could talk all day, but I know that I don't have time.
Yeah.
Thank you, yeah.
Anyone else? Alan.
Thank you very much. Yes, this has been a fascinating discussion, so thank you all. I'm wondering, you've all talked about variation in integration outcomes and policy interventions that can make a difference to those outcomes. I guess I'm wondering to what degree is variation in those outcomes attributable to specific kind of policy interventions that it's relatively easy for policymakers to tweak, and to what degree are there kind of deeper structural, cultural factors and so on that might underpin these outcomes?
Would anyone like to take that?
There are certainly deeper cultural and structural issues, and there's no doubt that native populations are nervous, at least in the first generation of newcomers from different cultural backgrounds. It's just clear in immigration history that that's the case. And it's very hard for governments to change those structural and cultural fears that populations have. And my view is the best that governments could do is try to ameliorate the excesses that's unnecessary. And for example, if housing is a big difficulty for immigrant populations, there are many ways of relieving that, and most of them have been found. We see from Marley, but we found the same thing, is that landlords are unwilling to take subsidies from the state very often. So subsidies for housing for immigrants, if this goes directly to the landlords and the landlords would prefer not to accept them, this is a policy that will be underutilized. Maybe cash transfers are a better way. Maybe working with landlords and trying to incentivize them to appreciate this population. So I'm all for experimentation on the margin. And that's, I think, the best we can do on a very difficult situation, a very difficult time, an era whether we have 80 million people in the world who are living outside their homeland.
Do either of you want to react to Alan?
I feel underqualified to give us a comprehensive response as David.
No, that's great. Other questions? Or I can jump in. Great. Thanks to everyone who's asked a question. We really appreciate all of your input. And if anyone has another question, just wave your hand. So I guess one of the questions that I have, and I struggle with this, and I'd be very curious to hear your reflection, is we had a lot of positive stories on the panel tonight, somewhat by design. So these are policies that work, and Alan, you suggested, well, maybe there are structural factors we can't change, but I think I would agree with David, on the margin we can make improvements, and we can avoid policies that actively drive people apart. And yet we're nevertheless in an unprecedented moment of the use of immigration and division between immigrants and non-immigrants as a political issue. And I was interested to hear what you think we can do as policymakers, as academics, to move the needle on this question. So maybe there are different perspectives on this. And so maybe on the UK side, Christabel or Marley. So Christabel, you've sort of been speaking a little bit to this, but maybe you can say more. I mean, what drives the reluctance to kind of read deeper in the polls? And how do we get beyond that? What can we do? Because you're suggesting that it's sort of a lack of willingness to get into the weeds, but that seems maybe a little too simplistic to me. So if we could understand why they're refusing to get into that information, and it seems to me like if you were advising the Tory government, you might be saying, actually, you should change your view, and what is preventing that?
Yeah, no, very much so. I mean, I suppose as somebody who I do, public opinion research for a living, I spend a lot of my time despairing at people misreading polls. It's not just simply on this issue. The way that journalists often report polling is, they'll go for a sort of very headline figure, and actually there's a lot more nuance underneath. They'll even misreport questions, let alone actually then sort of not see some of the insight that's beneath the initial questions. So I think that's kind of part of the problem, and that the news cycle moves very quickly. Politicians are limited in the amount of time that they have, and often they do see headlines that you can understand. You mentioned before that I was formerly a councillor in West London, and even if it's at a very local level, if you see lots and lots of letters coming in, emails, they are not letters anymore, that are coming into your inbox about a particular issue, even if you might suspect that this is not a representative sample of the population that is writing to you about this, it's hard to ignore. It's hard to ignore that volume of response that's coming in. It's hard to ignore the headlines. So I do have some sympathy with politicians. They are really, they're super busy, and they do have a sort of limited amount of time. I can spend all day kind of looking at YouGov tables. They don't have that. They don't have that ability. So I think it is a bit of a sort of. I think sometimes they just don't have the time, and there's just people read the headlines and believe them a lot of the time, I think.
And maybe just turning to you, David, if you were going to advise... Marley, jump in.
Yeah, that's okay, yeah.
Yeah,
I think immigration is an extremely visceral issue, which has historically, if you look across Europe, if you look in other, has mobilised support for populist radical right parties. And so you can see why mainstream parties are particularly concerned about this. Reform at the moment is an example of that. There are other, plenty of other examples, as David pointed out. There's the Sweden Democrats. There's plenty of other examples. So I think there aren't that many issues which have, in and of themselves, mobilised new political movements which have gained such traction. Compared to immigration. So in that respect, you can see that there's people are a bit nervous about it in a way that they aren't perhaps as nervous about some other issues. I think it has, it has a potential to create significant dividing lines between parties. And I think, I totally agree with what Christobel said, and the attitudes have shifted in a positive direction over the past couple of decades, but it can still. I think the concern in particular around management of migration and having a control policy and kind of images of people in small boats has a particular power and resonance with people, which for often doesn't directly affect people's lives, because people are most of the time are worrying about, at the moment, the cost of living crisis, about how NHS waiting lists and so on. And generally, it's just not going to directly impact people. It might impact people at the local level with concerns around integration, but often it's about a national issue. It's a concern about the national level, and people think about borders as almost a grounding point for kind of how they see the country and how they see the nation, and as a sort of a core responsibility for politicians to deliver on. So I think that creates this kind of visceral kind of resonance, which means that it has a particular power to sway politicians' mindsets.
Do you want to jump in, David?
Yeah, I have a question for Christobel. So, survey research, generally, people are nervous to say what sometimes their inner thoughts for what's socially respectable. So in the United States, psychologists give what's called an implicit attitudes test, and they find much higher levels of latent racism in these implicit tests than what people reveal in surveys. And conservatives, or in the United States, the Trumpists, may be understanding what I would call latent racism that isn't revealed in surveys, but which captures some inner feelings of dominant populations that they know they're not supposed to reveal. So how confident are you in the surveys that the conservatives really have it wrong?
I mean, you know, recent election results would indicate, certainly in terms of voting intention, that the polls are correct about that. Whether they're correct about attitudes towards migration, I mean, I think there's probably something in the fact that at the margins some people will hesitate about. I mean, obviously, if you ask us, if you ask us a direct question, are you prejudiced against migrants? Almost nobody, even in a survey, is going to tick yes. But I mean, I think there's a lot of other. I mean, we found, a majority of people still think that migration should be reduced. But when you sort of ask other questions, I thought it was quite revealing that, on our survey, for example, we had an option that says, I don't think there are any benefits to migration. You can answer that and not be a racist. Of course you can say that you don't think that there is any benefits to migration. And yet, a relatively small number of people did answer that. I mean, I don't think you can ever see into people's minds, but to some extent, even if people have an impulse towards a certain option, if they are restraining themselves, then to some extent, I mean, we all know that we all have biases, but I think that the fact that we then pull ourselves back to conform to some social norms, I mean, that's a sort of everyday fact of every moment of being a social animal. So I think that just to dismiss that as being false or not meaningful, I think it is a meaningful thing that people feel constrained, or not constrained, but feel that there are norms to which they should adhere.
Just to say on this, I find we've done lots of focus groups about attitudes with people on attitudes to migration, and I always find it fascinating because almost every time we did focus groups, we split them into two groups. And one group naturally gravitated towards a sort of pro-migration position, and one group naturally gravitated towards an anti-migration position, based on kind of what the median kind of person's viewpoint was on in each group. Because we get, assuming that we got a broad mix of attitudes, and that I think suggests that there are actual social norms on both sides. So generally speaking, if there are a few people in a group and they say, I think migration is a good thing, generally the people will be quiet who have got slightly more negative views, or they'll kind of shift their perspective because they want to find a consensus. But the same thing goes the other way around. So I don't think people are quite happy to talk about concerns, and they want to align with their fellow participants in the focus group and talk about their concerns about immigration, and they can get kind of quite riled up about it. So I don't know how much of a factor it is, because basically social norms can go either way, I think, on the issue of migration in many respects.
Great, thanks for that response. And David, I think you went in the direction I was thinking or leading you towards, which is thinking about the application of the UK case to the US. And so wondering about whether we think that there's an overestimation of this issue's importance in the US or not, maybe as we're seeing in the UK. But we can leave that for the next time, for the next panel on US politics, which sadly will have to be 6 months from now, because Policy and Practice is taking a break, and we've come to the end of our time tonight. And the next time we'll see all of you will be in October. So I just wanted to thank everyone who was able to come tonight, and to thank our 3 panelists, so Marley, Christabel, and David. And I hope everyone has a great night. Thank you so much.